In the previous video in this series, I got as far as getting a reasonable sized image on the CRT. I'm currently trying to modify this board to use a wider angle deflection CRT. The original CRT in this ADM3 was destroyed, the neck had been broken off, and because it's so difficult and expensive getting that sort of tube in the UK, I'm trying to see if it's possible to use a CRT out of a black and white portable TV. But these typically used a much wider angle deflection tube. That in turn needs higher drive currents and a different drive current profile in the deflection coils. So I've been trying to modify the existing or the original CRT control board. Getting fairly close now, and I've probably gone as far as I'm going to until we get the main ADM3 board working. So I'll just move the camera so you can see the display on the CRT. Okay, so as you can hopefully see, I'm getting a much better sized image on the CRT now. It's also fairly linear. It's not perfect yet. I still get some compression at the top and bottom, but you tend to get that on the ADM3 displays anyway. And in particular, I will tend to get that when I'm driving it using signal generators, because the sync pulse duration and the relative timing of the sync pulses is used on the control board to pre-charge a couple of capacitors that determine to a certain extent the linearity of the display in the X and Y directions. So there's no point me going any further with linearity adjustments until I've got this running from the proper board. Ignore any sort of banding you're seeing on this. It's not visible in real life, it's just the camera shutter speed as ever. One thing that may be an issue with this later is the phosphor on a TV is normally shorter duration or persistence than you typically use in a monitor. But hopefully it won't be too bad. We'll have to see and see if we can do anything about that nearer the time. But the next thing to do is to try and get this CRT actually fitted into the ADM3 top cover. The ADM uses kind of custom mounts for the CRT, so we'll have to see if we can do something about modifying those or manufacturing our own. But the first thing we need to do is figure out the relative size and position of the mounting lugs on this CRT and see how that compares to the original CRT. So I'll get this powered off, I'll get the board disconnected, and we'll put this CRT alongside the original, and we'll go from there. So I have the two CRTs side by side. We've got the original on the right and the one we want to try and use on the left. You can see how much shallower this one is compared to the original, and what we're interested in here is these are the mounting brackets for the original CRT. Basically stiffeners and mounting brackets, and they kind of lock into the upper case on the ADM3 enclosure. But they are custom to this. They're obviously very specific to that enclosure. But as you can see here, the distance between the mounting lug, which is here on the original CRT, and the front face, the curve is about the same on both, of course, but the distance of these lugs from the bench now is much greater on the original than it is on the replacement, and that's simply because the replacement has the implosion guard built directly into the tube, whereas the original tube has got a separate guard on the front, and that's what you remove if you want to deal with the cataracts on the original CRT. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drill out these rivets. Unfortunately they're not screwed in, they're riveted, and normally you have to be fairly careful doing this, but of course this tube is destroyed. Let's move the camera. As you can see, the neck has been broken off. You can also see how much shorter the new tube is, and so we don't need to be too careful with this. It's not going to implode now that it's already lost its vacuum, so I can fairly safely drill out these mounting posts, and we can either then manufacture our own version of these and then remount these onto the tube, or we can come up with some variation. So what I'll do, I'll get these drilled off, we'll get the outer case onto the bench, slot these in, and then we'll see how they line up with the CRT and what the best approach will be to getting this mounted. I've drilled off the original mounts from the original CRT. These are fairly easy to remove, they're just held on with what amounts to a glorified pop rivet. So drill the head off and then you can pop these off and it separates the mounting cheeks from the CRT. I've got the new CRT just resting in the case of the ADM3. You can see how much shorter this CRT is compared to the original, but the curve does match fairly well to the curve of the original, which is not surprising because obviously it has to follow a certain profile for it to work. The side cheeks don't fit perfectly onto the CRT, unfortunately. The original CRT mounting lugs were further round to the short side of the tube, and on this one they're further round to the long side, so the holes don't line up properly. But I can make up an adapter plate to sit between the mounting plates and the CRT lugs. Got about a 2mm gap between the mounting plates and the CRT lugs when I have the clamp plates fitted. So it should all fit together fairly nicely and it'd be quite a nice secure fitting. It just, as I say, will require me to make up some small plates. I could make up completely new mounting plates, but I don't really want to go to all the time and trouble to do that. It's not really necessary, and I think it will be fine with just some small adapters made up for the corners. Once I've done that, I can get this bolted into place. We can refit the control board and then we can plug this onto the main control board for the ADM3 and we're ready to start testing. I spent a few minutes looking at the tube and trying to figure out the best way to mount this onto the existing brackets. As I said, on the original tube, these mounting tabs are more to the short side, so they're more round in this direction. So these don't really fit directly on, and I was trying to figure out the best way to do this without going to anything particularly complex or having to make new brackets. Before we get into that, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, I'd said that there was a significant difference, in fact I showed there was a significant difference between the height of the tabs on the new tube relative to the front face and the tabs on the old tube relative to the front face. In fact, on the old tube the tabs were about 3.5mm higher, so when we put them side by side they were about 3.5mm higher up, and if we just tried bolting this directly in the same, we'd have a 3.5mm gap between the front face of the tube and the plastic housing. But it just so happens, fortunately, that the thickness of these brackets is about 2.5mm and the thickness of the tab is about 1mm, and so on the original mounting these brackets were on the front face, if you like, front facing side of these tabs, whereas I'm going to mount them the other way. So that gives me, effectively moves the tube forward by the thickness of the tab plus the thickness of the bracket, and that just in this case fortuitously works out exactly what we want. So the next thing was how to mount these, and what I've come up with is a simple system. I've just been over to the workshop, made a couple of special nuts. These fit under here. The flat section is because the hole's too close to the tube to have a kind of a big diameter nut all the way around, and I didn't want to go too small because it might cause too much flexing on the tab. So these then fit up into here, and we then just simply bolt them in. They're tapped M4, and I've drilled a couple of holes in the brackets in what I think is the right place, and I can now screw these on. I haven't done the back end yet, so I'll need something different there. There isn't enough material to do the same thing there. It'd be nice if these were say 10mm longer, would have made life a lot easier, but they're not. So what I'll do, I'll get these screwed on both sides and then we'll try offering this up to the case and see if it's in the right place. So I've got the new fittings screwed into the tube at the front end, it's actually the top, and the bottom is still loose, but even so, with the clamping brackets on, you can see it's very nicely mounted the tube. It's not going to move around. In fact, I could leave it like this, it's probably not going to go anywhere, but just for security reasons I want to put some fittings in the bottom, so I'll make something similar to the rear ones, just have to have an offset hole. But what I can do now, these are only finger tight, but even so it's holding in the tube quite nicely. What I can do now is flip it the other way up, and we'll see how it looks and how well the new tube matches up to the case. So as you can see, it fits very nicely into the case. As I said previously, there is quite a lot of the screen obscured by the case, which is why we don't need the image to be the full size of the tube. So what I'll do in the next video is we'll power this back up, put it back on the signal generators, and see how the image looks with the tube bolted into the case. Assuming it works fine still and the image looks reasonable and the tube is nicely secured, it's not going to go anywhere, and we can then get on and start working on the main board. But it looks like this is going to be a reasonable way of mounting the tube. It's going to be nice and secure. It's pretty much the same as the original, and there's a very slight mismatch. It's probably like a 1mm gap at the front centre, but there was on the old tube. I think this case might be slightly distorted. The top is perfect, but the bottom is out slightly. I can move it a bit closer by adjusting the bracket, and also the bottom clamps are not fully tightened, so this will close up a little bit, but even so it's an extremely nice fit, and it actually looks very nice. If anything, it's a brighter looking screen. Even when it's turned off, it's clearly a whiter screen, but it should give us a very nice contrast, and hopefully it will work with the ADM3. We'll have to see.